What you know, Alibis. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It is Sunday, February 16th. I'm using the weekend to get caught up on some of the cases we're following. It's just impossible to stay on top of everything, sitting in court 8 hours a day and then coming home and doing those recap episodes. But it's a long weekend. We're going to chip away at some of these updates. And today we're going to talk about Donna Adelson. It's probably going to take a couple of episodes to get caught up with everything going on in Donna's world. This episode, we're going to talk about Donna asking to be released on bond, saying that she's been abused and extorted while in jail. She's asking for an Arthur hearing. Well, what's that? It's a small-scale trial-like hearing in Florida that determines if a defendant should be released on bond. It's used for non-bondable offenses, which are usually punishable by life in prison. Her attorneys are going to have to argue that she's not a flight risk, and also they'll have to prove to the judge that there's not enough evidence against her that would make a conviction likely. Let's read the filing. The first section is incarceration issues, the medical issues of Mrs. Adelson. Mrs. Adelson is a 75-year-old female with typical medical issues of aging, made worse by the conditions of confinement. Hearing problems that are compounded due to a medical issue that cannot be addressed by medical personnel at the Leon County Detention Facility, and it has in parentheses, prior to incarceration, she saw an ENT every 3 to 4 months to have her extremely small ear canals cleansed out with proper equipment, as general flushing will not resolve her issue. Severe pain from a pre-existing medical condition in her back and legs that cannot be relieved by the medical care available at the detention facility, and excruciating pain in her left shoulder, down her arm, and into her hand as a result of an injury received during an attack by another inmate at the detention facility. Within the past few months, Mrs. Adelson has begun experiencing shortness of breath that has reached the level where others comment about hearing her struggle to breathe. Undersigned counsel has actually had difficulty hearing phone conversations with Mrs. Adelson because her breathing is so labored that it interferes with phone reception. On a visit to the medical unit with other inmates on February 3rd, 2025, even the medical personnel asked what the loud breathing noise was, and the other inmates pointed at Mrs. Adelson. Oddly enough, when Mrs. Adelson was having a medical visit with the doctor at the detention center prior to February 3rd, 2025, the doctor refused to even listen to Mrs. Adelson's chest because, quote, that was not the reason we are here, and you will need to get another appointment with the physician's assistant, end quote. On Sunday, February 1st, 2025, in the early morning hours, Mrs. Adelson was in the bathroom area and accidentally bumped up against a washing machine, cutting herself on her right arm on a rusted metal bar on the machine. The nurse was in the pod, so Mrs. Adelson showed it to the nurse, who told her how bad it looked but said she had no Band-Aid. The nurse told her to wrap it in toilet paper so the bleeding would stop, and then fill out a sick call form to request a Band-Aid and turn it in with the night nurse that would be there around midnight. Turning it in with the night nurse would mean she would get a Band-Aid the following morning. Unfortunately, the nurse had no sick call forms for Mrs. Adelson to complete, so there was no way to make a request. Finally, on Sunday morning, February 2nd, 2025, at 10 a.m., a sergeant sent a Band-Aid down for Mrs. Adelson and also provided sick call forms, which Mrs. Adelson filled out, requesting that each of her medical issues, including the cut, be addressed. On Monday, February 3rd, 2025, Mrs. Adelson was finally taken to the medical unit. Her wound was cleaned and she received a tetanus shot. Mrs. Adelson needs medical care that simply cannot be obtained at the detention facility. She needs an appointment with an ear, nose, and throat specialist, an orthopedist, and a physical therapist at minimum. If she remains incarcerated pending trial, the defense will need to prepare motions to seek permission for Mrs. Adelson to receive care outside of the Leon County Detention Center and obtain a court order for each appointment to be scheduled, which would then require jail personnel to transport Mrs. Adelson to her appointments. Obtaining proper medical care would result in a hardship for Leon County Detention Center and its staff. The next section, attorney client privilege. It is impossible for Mrs. Adelson to engage in attorney client privileged communications via phone communication while incarcerated. Within the pod, more than 60 other inmates have the opportunity to listen to her side of the conversations. It is difficult at best for her attorneys to hear Mrs. Adelson when she speaks due to the enormous amount of background noise caused by static, phone connection issues on the tablet, and noise from the inmates in the background. Mrs. Adelson has had to get onto her bed and cover her head with her blanket so that she can hear counsel and counsel can hear her. On one recent occasion, when Mrs. Adelson ended the phone call and pulled the covers off of her head, there was a guard standing over her listening to her phone call. Another inmate reported that the guard stood there listening for several minutes of the call. Once Mrs. Adelson ended the call, the guard proceeded to search all of Mrs. Adelson's items and discarded the headphones she uses to listen to the recorded materials related to her case. In parentheses, it has recorded phone calls, etc. The next section, lack of sleep. The schedule maintained for providing food and medication to the inmates at the detention center results in Mrs. Adelson sleeping on average 2 hours each 24-hour period, and many times much less than that. A typical day for Mrs. Adelson is as follows. Nighttime medication distribution, 11:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. Sleep commences after inmates quiet down, 1:30 a.m. Awaken for breakfast, 3:30 a.m. Lay awake in dark on bed until lunch served, 9:30 a.m. Lay awake in dark on bed until lights on, 3:30 p.m. Possibly leave bed and walk around in circles for exercise depending on who the guard is. Dinner is served at 6 p.m. and then back on bunk until nighttime medication at 12 a.m. The next section, physical abuse. In addition to the initial period of incarceration previously complained of to the court, where Mrs. Adelson was placed in a cell with a mattress on the floor where she had to lay without clothing for more than 50 days, Mrs. Adelson has been physically abused and threatened with abuse throughout her incarceration at the Leon County Detention Center. To understand the nature of some of these issues, it would be helpful for the court to be aware that the shower and bathroom areas of the pods at the detention center have no security cameras and are not manned with guards for the safety of inmates. One of the first acts of physical abuse by another inmate took place while Mrs. Adelson was showering and was of a sexual nature. She thought she was alone in the area while she was showering when all of a sudden she felt another inmate run her hand up her entire spine from just above her buttocks to the area of her neck. The inmate asked Mrs. Adelson if she liked it, and in response, Mrs. Adelson, very frightened, began to scream, which caused the aggressor/inmate to leave the area. Mrs. Adelson did all she could to avoid this woman during the remainder of that inmate's incarceration at Leon County Detention Center. Most recently, as Mrs. Adelson was standing in the area of and facing her bunk bed, another inmate slammed into her from behind, knocking Mrs. Adelson into the frame of the bed. This was very painful to Mrs. Adelson. When she turned around and asked why the woman had done that, the inmate replied, quote, "Because you are a effing killer," end quote. The most severe and frightening incident to date, however, occurred several months ago and again was in the bathroom area of the pod. Based on the records obtained, the incident occurred on or shortly before October 7th, 2024. Mrs. Adelson was bent over brushing her teeth with her right hand and leaning on the sink with her left hand. All of a sudden, she felt her left arm being jerked violently behind and up her back. As she was yanked in that direction, a much larger inmate told her she knew Mrs. Adelson got canteen and that from now on, she was going to get canteen for her too. When Mrs. Adelson tried to ask why she would do that, she was told by the larger inmate that she was going to do it. Mrs. Adelson was scared for her life and what more physical harm would come to her if she didn't comply. From that point forward, this aggressive inmate has instructed Mrs. Adelson what canteen packages she wanted ordered on a weekly basis. Afraid for her life, Mrs. Adelson began telling her husband to order the packages each week. She never told her husband why, and he just assumed Mrs. Adelson wanted the food for herself because the meals provided by the Leon County Detention Center are disgusting. After Mrs. Adelson receives her own canteen purchased through the normal jail site, she also receives the two separate packages from the site ordered by her husband. She keeps the additional canteen items in the area of her bunk bed, and either the aggressive inmate comes to get the items herself or sends someone else to get the items as she wants. This particular incident caused terrible pain to Mrs. Adelson on the day of the incident and has continued to this day. She has requested medical treatment from the jail for this pain on numerous occasions, but has gotten no relief. It has caused excruciating pain in her left shoulder that shoots down her arm, and at some times she even has a tingling in her fingers. Since the court heard the original motion made by initial counsel, some jail staff, including supervisors, continue to take actions which can only be intended to punish Mrs. Adelson. For example, inmates are provided with locked storage bins to store commissary and personal items. Mrs. Adelson has been allowed 2 additional bins for her legal materials. On more than one occasion, by different officers, Mrs. Adelson's legal materials have been tossed out of her storage bin, resulting in hundreds of pages being tossed about and left out of order. Guards have commented in the presence of other inmates about Mrs. Adelson's perceived wealth, which led to additional requests by other inmates for Mrs. Adelson's commissary. The next section, solitary confinement. Mrs. Adelson has attempted to seek medical care for her pain, shortness of breath, and other health issues for several months, and her requests for appointments have been routinely denied or not properly addressed. However, on Monday, February 3rd, 2025, when she was finally taken to the medical unit and all of her issues, including the cut, were being addressed, the physician's assistant asked about the pain in the left shoulder and arm and how it started. Mrs. Adelson disclosed how she had been attacked by a fellow inmate. Therefore, without the knowledge of Mrs. Adelson, the medical unit reported the attack to jail personnel. Within a short period of time, 2 supervisors at the jail came into the annex and told Mrs. Adelson to roll up her bed and get her bins because she was being removed from the pod. They explained Mrs. Adelson had done nothing wrong and then took her into a room to question her about the attack. Mrs. Adelson was very reluctant to disclose any information because she truly fears retaliation by the aggressor and or her affiliates within the jail, of which she has many that Mrs. Adelson has already had to deal with. Mrs. Adelson finally disclosed all of the facts, including the extortion by the aggressor and how her husband unknowingly satisfying the demands by purchasing 2 extra packages of canteen each week, so spare Mrs. Adelson of additional physical harm. Note, from October 7th, 2024 to present, Mr. Adelson has spent $1,150 on this separate canteen. The jail supervisors advised Mrs. Adelson that it was their responsibility to protect her, and the only way they can do that is to put her in solitary confinement. Therefore, since Monday, February 3rd, 2025, Mrs. Adelson has been placed in a cell by herself. She is only allowed outside her cell on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 1 hour in the morning, and on Tuesday and Thursday for 30 minutes. When she is released, she has no contact with anyone else and can only use the time to shower, walk on the rec deck, or watch television. Other than that, she is on complete lockdown in a 6x9 room that has a bed, a toilet, and a sink. Note, the toilet is in full view of the window on the door that is approximately 4 inches across by 30 inches high. Thus, the staff of the detention facility has determined the only way they can adequately protect Mrs. Adelson from any future physical harm from inmates is to house her in solitary confinement. Therefore, Mrs. Adelson is being punished for having been physically attacked, injured, and extorted for the past 4 months. The next section, no risk of harm to the community. Mrs. Adelson is a 75-year-old woman with physical impediments, with no prior criminal history and no disciplinary issues during her entire incarceration at the detention center for the last 14 months. There are no allegations that she personally engaged in any conduct herself that resulted in harm to anyone, including Mr. Markel. The next section, not a flight risk. Mrs. Adelson has no passport and has been placed on a no-flight list and thus cannot schedule a flight bound for any domestic or foreign destination. Her husband is 80 years old and would relocate to live with Mrs. Adelson in Tallahassee, Florida, from release through the trial. There are several pages of legal arguments citing a bunch of case law. I'm not going to go through all those. And in conclusion, it says, in summary, Mrs. Adelson is being held in the Leon County Detention Center awaiting trial under conditions that will result in her inability to receive a fair trial and unable to adequately participate in preparation for her defense at trial. Her health is failing. She is in constant pain. She cannot hear normal discussions, much less any reduced level speaking with counsel at counsel table at trial. And she is not receiving a fraction of the amount of sleep necessary to assist in her defense. At this point, Mrs. Adelson is aware that the remainder of her time at the detention center leading up to and during trial, she will be in solitary confinement without any access to interaction with other friendly inmates, art classes, or any other human contact whatsoever, appointments with attorneys accepted. Her incarceration should have ended upon the conclusion of her trial in September 2024. Through no fault of her own, her attorneys were removed from her case and her trial was continued for a period of more than 9 months, thus extending her period of incarceration. The next section is the proposed conditions of release. Mrs. Adelson is aware of the seriousness of the offenses for which she has been charged and that the court would not consider the typical conditions of pretrial release and proposes that in addition to the monetary bond requirement, the court impose the following conditions of pretrial release: electronic monitoring, and Mrs. Adelson will reside with her husband within Leon County, Tallahassee, Florida, pending the outcome of the trial, with the request that the location be shared only with the court, the state, the defense, and the pretrial release officer for the safety of herself and her husband. Comply with a curfew at the residence from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., with the only exceptions being appointments with her attorney, for court, or for medical purposes. No travel outside of Leon County, Florida. Report to a pretrial release officer on whatever schedule is deemed necessary by the court and any other conditions the court deems reasonably appropriate. That was pretty much the bulk of that filing, and Judge Everett has set a hearing date for February 26th. I'll keep you guys posted. Hopefully going to have another episode out today reading another filing in this case. But that's it for this one. Hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, and we will see you soon.